Welcome to this special edition of True Crime and Legal Updates. Today, I'll be speaking with Chris Shelton on the status of the Danny Masterson trial. We'll be going over all of the happenings since the mistrial was declared, including his interview with Jury Foreman Earl. This conversation took place prior to additional information being disclosed during Chris's second conversation with the jury foreman. Details on that can be found in the links I'll list below for both Chris and Tony Ortega's channel. Welcome, Chris. It's so nice for you to join me again. When you tell everybody basically what you're doing with your YouTube channel and why it is I like to talk to you so much about Scientology.
Sure. So my name is Chris Shelton. I am a former Scientologist. I've been out of that group for the last 10 years. I escaped in 2013. And I have been running a YouTube channel. I have written a book about the subject of Scientology. I have put together a podcast where I've interviewed psychologists and sociologists and even neuroscientists about the subject of coercive control and cults and what goes on in these destructive groups. And I've kind of made it my life mission to push back and try to educate the public about destructive cult groups like Scientology.
Oh, I really, you're doing amazing stuff there. I recommend everybody check out the channel. One of the main reasons I like to talk to you, especially about Scientology and more so about the Masterson trial, is that coercive control. Because in this particular case, would you agree with the Masterson trial, that was very evident, the Scientology techniques that were being used against these women.
Well, I wish they had been more evident. And I think that that was part of the problem in the cases. We weren't able, the prosecution, not we, I'm not involved in that.
Yeah.
The prosecution was not really able to make the case they should have been able to make. And at least as I see it, and I could be wrong, I'm no legal eagle. I don't understand the law the same way a lawyer does. So I've only got a limited understanding of it. But it seems to me that interviewing the jury and talking and watching that thing so closely, they didn't really get it. And it is coercive control. You're absolutely right. It's textbook what Danny Masterson did to these women.
It is, and not being able to show that that was actually techniques from Scientology, why the women wouldn't report what was going on. I do applaud Judge Almedo, and I know you have too. Like, that was a fine line to walk on, legally, to try to not give them the mistrial, because if they did make it too much about Scientology, then it's not a fair trial for Danny Masterson. So she had a fine line to walk, and she did the best that she could. And I think the prosecution could have found other creative ways with witnesses in the expert department to bring it forward without actual testimony, but being limited to just how the women felt about it. Maybe more I don't know, like you, I'm not a legal expert, but maybe more witnesses saying why the women felt what they felt and how normal that was about they felt. We had one. And then you did have that interview with Tony Ortega and the jury foreman, Earl was his name.
Correct.
I was surprised to hear during that they didn't really pay much attention to that expert witness.
No. And that was actually shocking to me. It shouldn't have been, because I understand how psychology is regarded in the world, and it's mostly thought of as a bunch of opinions by a bunch of opinionated people, and psychology doesn't really work, and all this kind of nonsense that we hear from people from time to time who just don't know what they're really talking about. And this jury, unfortunately, had members who treated the expert witness testimony that way. They just disregarded it completely, wrote it off, and said, well, it's just somebody's opinion. And if the defense wanted to, they could bring in somebody else to say the exact opposite. And therefore, we don't have to listen to this woman. And I really thought that was a callous level of disregard for the facts that she testified to, Ms. Mechanic, the expert. So that was shocking and disappointing. Yeah, I was pretty upset about that.
Yeah, me, and I was trying to figure out why. And the more I thought about it, I remember the witness lists from when the trial started
Yep.
because, like yourself, I followed the trial all the way through. But all the whole time this has been out there, I've been following it before we even got to actual criminal charges against him. So I'm looking at the witness list that Philip Cohen put forward. There were 3 expert witnesses on there. Last minute, they decide not to put any.
That's right.
And I'm wondering if that set a little bug in their ear, a little bug to the jury, like, well, that's not important then. Like,
You
we
know,
don't
that's
need
a good
it.
point. That's a good
I'm
point.
wondering if that was a like, I'm wondering why he did it all along. And then when I heard what the juror said, I said, very clever, Mr. Cohen, very clever, because you just made expert testimony in this case irrelevant.
That's right.
Like, wow. Like,
Exactly.
wow.
That's
Like
right.
it and then the same thing with Danny not speaking for himself. Like, no need to. This is not necessary. Like,
Well, and that's
yeah.
pretty common. That's
Yeah.
no,
Like,
no,
no, don't.
nobody was going to let him take the
Yeah.
stand. That would have been a
Yeah.
disaster.
But I thought it was quite clever that, they had 3 on the list. And actually the prosecution only had the one and they presented it, but they had 3 on the other side and they just decided not to go forward with any of them. It might have been quite the clever move. So I do hope. What do you think? Perhaps the prosecution bringing forward maybe victim advocates instead of psychologists that talk about the normalcy of how these women presented their case. Because my concern was how often the word inconsistency was used, even when you had even during your interview with the jury foreman. He
Right.
kept going back to that differences in the stories, but yet no credible conversation about how long it had been, and how many different reports we had in
Yeah.
the time frames. You got a report in 3 years, a report in 7 years, a report in 10 years. Of course, there's going to be some inconsistencies.
Well, exactly. And also the source of the information. I mean, they were basing an awful lot of the inconsistencies on one point, that thing with the gun and brandishing the gun, for example. The fact that it appeared in one place and it didn't appear in another. What they didn't do is contextualize the information. The point I'm making is there was a written report that she had written
Mhm.
that said or that did not say anything about the gun. And then
Mhm.
they go into the fact that the desk sergeant, the
Right.
desk watch guy, didn't write down gun on the report.
Mhm.
And then she's testifying to the fact of a gun. But what they weren't looking at is that report that it wasn't mentioned in the first initial report she
Mhm.
wrote. That was overseen by Scientology.
Right.
So a Scientology ethics officer was standing over her the whole time she's writing that report. So the fact the gun wasn't mentioned in there was, pretty obviously because the
Mhm.
Scientology ethics officer didn't want that mentioned in the report. Now, I say obviously because, of course, I know about Scientology, but it wasn't even really explored or given any credence or possibility. In other words, they weren't aware of the Scientology influence and they discounted it so they couldn't be aware of it. And by they, I mean the jury themselves. They didn't pay
Right.
any attention to it.
No, because the
You know?
prosecution wasn't allowed to mention
Well,
that
they
they're
mentioned it
yeah.
enough times that they could have had some consideration of
I'm
it,
hoping.
but they
Yeah.
just blew it off.
They
And I am upset that they weren't able to bring it in more,
they also blew off the
you know.
prosecution bringing forward that, although not mentioned in the report, a search for a gun license and registration was made afterwards. So there must have been some talk about it.
Exactly.
Why would the sergeant go and run Masterson for owning a gun if a gun was never mentioned?
There you go.
With these statements go, there is a verbal part, what she says to the officers, right? And
Yep.
then there's the actual writing down of it. They may not be exact,
Exactly.
okay? But he was operating on information that he had.
That's right.
Somebody said gun. Why would he run it? And he even said it wasn't standard. You don't always run a gun thing on everybody that comes forward with
Mm,
the statement. He
mm,
said that. I heard it. I'm like, why are they not considering any of this?
right. Well,
Um
there's another aspect to this which I'm going to bring up. Again, I'm not an expert on any of this, so I'm just going to throw some words around, and I don't
Mhm.
know, that anything's going to be done about this. But I believe we're bordering on jury misconduct with the way that they disregarded,
Mhm.
callously and blatantly disregarded, expert witness testimony and the contextualization of the information. So the foreman says, "Well, we did this very careful job. We wrote it all on a board. We did
Mhm.
all this work," and I said, "Well, look, I respect you for having done all that, but I did not at the same time gonna want to get into a big argument with the guy. I didn't see the
Mhm.
point." So I didn't bring up my issues and problems with what they had done, which was to disregard
Right.
a whole bunch of evidence, and it's just not their job to do that. Their
Mhm.
job is to think with all the information that is presented to them, not just take a whole section of it and go, "Well, this doesn't matter because I say so."
Mhm.
I think that's jury misconduct. Now we've already got a mistrial, so it's not a question of,
Yeah, it's not a question of whether it's gonna go forward,
yeah,
thankfully. Yes,
but
that
you
brings to
can have,
mind Tuesday. Yeah.
yeah, but you
Yeah.
can have that kind of thing happen. There's sometimes where there's jury misconduct in the opposite direction, where they're finding somebody guilty that the evidence just isn't there. But in this case, when you're just disregarding evidence
Mhm.
wholesale and admitting to that, I have to question the integrity of the process.
True, because he actually used those words. We didn't look at that. He said several times, "We didn't look at that at all.
That's
We
right.
didn't consider that at all." And I'm like, "Wow, a juror saying this, you're supposed to look at everything." I
Exactly.
mean, here I am, admittedly somewhat biased because I've been following it, okay, for so long. So I've got a little skewed view, and I will admit it. Like, I'm doing the best I can to follow all the evidence anyway. Anything Philip Cohen said, I was trying to actually give it credible weight, and consider it. And I'm not on the jury. Like, I expect double that from the jury as far as the prosecution and the evidence and what the women are saying. We have to remember it's just 12 people, just 12 ordinary people. Maybe not a fascination with law, maybe not a fascination with, hopefully not with Scientology and or Masterson's career. They're obviously not advocates for survivors of abuse, so they're just average people with like no real bias in any way. But it's such a serious, I think it's such a serious thing to be on a jury. I was
I do
very
too.
disappointed
Me
with the
too.
words he used.
I think that there's also something you just mentioned that I think I want to comment on.
Mhm,
Because this jury was biased,
mhm,
and they're supposed to not be biased, and that's
mhm,
a nice imaginary state of being for people, that we're going to be unbiased, because we are all biased. But I
mhm.
think that there was a particular bias entered into this jury, and the foreman seemed to express it a few times, but it's a very subtle one. It's a very almost covert one. I don't even know that they were aware of it, and that
Mhm.
is that there's this sort of level of, I don't like the word, but it seems to be the only way to communicate the concept I'm trying to get across, and that is misogyny. I don't
There
think
was
the jury overtly hates women. I don't think that's exactly
mm-mm,
precisely what's going on, but I think that there is a cultural phenomenon of not believing women under certain circumstances because people project this idea that, well, I wouldn't do that in that situation, therefore she couldn't have, or
mhm,
she wouldn't have, because it doesn't make any sense.
right.
And that's where people lose their damn minds, because if you think you're going to be assaulted or end up in a violent situation and you're going to act normal,
Right.
what does that even mean in
It
that
does it
context?
I think you've got something there. I often found myself thinking, how could they possibly put themselves in the women's positions? They
Right.
don't know enough about Scientology. They're not allowed to know enough about Scientology to know the frame of mind that they were in. They don't know about this, what I call second citizenship that you have. Like, you're lower than to begin with. You are pushed down, made feel less than, secondary to whatever the man wants in the relationship anyway. They weren't allowed to get all of that information. They got very little of it. And what they did get, they kind of disregarded as, you knew what you signed up for. You were a Scientologist, so that's just the way it is. Like, so, like, and I was
Exactly.
I was like, wow. Like,
Yeah.
wow, how easy did that happen? That just shows you how ingrained these microaggressions are in our society. And they sit there and tell us that, like, oh, Bear, you got a chip on your shoulder about that. I said, no, like I've lived it these years. This exists. And if you feel I'm a little aggressive about it, it's because you're not hearing me. You're
Right.
not hearing me that these little things that you do to make me less than matter because you're putting acceptance on it for everybody else and society in general. If we don't push back against it, and it does affect it. It's making it bigger. It's making it so that we can't remove it. It's making it acceptable under the wire.
That's right.
Nobody will come out and admit it, but they're all acting like it's totally acceptable. It is no big deal.
And yeah, exactly. I could not agree with you more there. And it's actually even worse because it goes to a level where people are not even aware that they're doing it. And that's where we get into this
Mm-hmm.
concept of an implicit bias. And this is controversial. And I understand that some people don't agree with this
Mm-hmm.
psychologically, or they think that, we're full of it or something. But the fact of the matter is, people have hidden influencers. They've got ideas in their mind that are so, base and core to themselves that they don't think about them.
Mm-hmm.
Moral values and things like that, our sense of right and wrong. And when people come into a situation like these jurors did, where they're going to prejudge a woman's behavior based on what they think they would do in that same circumstance, I mean, that's kind of the definition of empathy. It's an effort
Mm-hmm.
to understand by putting
Right.
yourself in somebody else's place. But to then conclude, well, to then go the additional mile of, okay, well, it doesn't make any sense to me because I wouldn't do that, I think. So therefore, I'm going to conclude that she's a liar.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where it becomes twisted. It's that moment where the person is giving into their nonsensical bias rather than acknowledging, hey, wait a second, this doesn't make any sense to me. Why don't I find out more about it?
Mm-hmm.
And had the jury had that attitude, then Ms. Mechanic's expert testimony would have made a lot more sense to them.
They would have actually taken it into consideration at the end.
Exactly.
But instead of saying, okay, she said this day and that day, instead of saying why, they said, oh, liar. They didn't
That's
even
right.
look for the why.
That's
The
right.
why was right there. The expert testimony of Mindy Mechanic said why,
That's
said
right.
how this happens, and that it's very, very common. I commend the prosecution for bringing that forward because, we had this large time. When we look at it realistically, legally, they had a big mountain to climb just based on the statute of limitations and how long between the assaults. Okay.
Yep.
We have to also look socially what was going on around the Masterson trial, which I think may have contributed to some of the bias of the jury, was how many men were being prosecuted at the time for older crimes and group crimes against them, women coming together and saying, oh no, you did this to me, and to where there was this social upheaval and this backlash against the man that he was guilty in the public no matter what the trial said
Right.
already. And I think that may have unfortunately been contributing to some of this misogynistic bias that I do see that are mentioning. I did see
Yeah.
it. And I think it was only like a reflex as to protect someone who may be innocent. Like maybe not misogynistic, like born in there, like they're just like, man versus woman, but just like innocent person getting piled on in the media.
Exactly.
Like, okay. And like it could have been a man or a woman. It's just like innocent person getting piled on, and I'm on the jury now, and I'm not letting that happen. And Cohen
That's
did a
right.
really good job of using that. I
He
mean,
did, and I
he
think
did.
I think Earl, the jury foreman, was crystal clear that that's where he was. What you just described is
Yeah.
where he was kind of coming from, and I certainly didn't appreciate that, but I understand it. It's,
Same with me. I
yeah,
understand it. I could see it. I saw it has. I know the hooks why. It's not that, it's Danny Masterson. It was the statute of limitations for me. The actual, I believe very strongly that those regulations need to be amended for all assault victims because of the trauma of assault
That's
everybody handles it differently, and to actually put a time frame on that, on when you're going to be able to move forward, is ridiculous. And we have made strides, especially in assault cases that need DNA that gets preserved now until you're ready. And like, you get some choices and options, and the way they handle those interviews and things, some of that is all changed, and I'm all for it. It does need to be looked at, that statute of limitations. And it was also the matter of consent. Conscious consent in legal terms is really an iffy kind of thing. You know what I'm saying? Like, they
Mhm.
don't have strong enough language about the fact that if you're sleeping, that's an unconscious state. Like, I've been looking at some of the research that they're doing on that, and how many in relationship assaults happen in that manner.
Right.
And
Yeah, it's
yeah.
bad. You can't, and that's what I mean about that sort of whole cultural implicit bias thing, is we
Mhm,
got years and decades and millennia of stuff to overcome with that.
mhm,
Around that concept of consent. And really, if people could just kind of get that straight, I think
mhm,
a lot of this nonsense would clear up. But there's just so many people who just keep
mhm,
insisting that consent is not consent, and that you don't have to say yes and no means yes and all this other nonsense. And it's this really kind of twisted field, so it's confusing for people. The psychology of it is confusing for people.
mhm,
The fact that when it's in a relationship situation versus stranger danger, it becomes incredibly more complicated to understand, because there's more going on than just some guy assaulting a woman.
mhm.
It's There's more layers to the behavior and why people act the way they do. This is complicated stuff, and people lose their minds, and they'd rather just think with the simplicity of, oh, she probably wanted it anyway, and who cares, right? And they just move on.
And I heard this. I hate to keep going back to this jury foreman, but he's the only voice for the jury that I have in my head right now. Is he was speaking for them. He was the foreman. He was there. When he brought up the fact that they all saw him afterwards, that they all had some type of relationship or connection with him afterwards, and some of them actually had repeated relations with him afterwards.
Yep,
And he just said he couldn't understand. Like,
that's right.
basically the attitude he get is, I don't understand. I couldn't understand that. Like, if you were assaulted, why would you go back? Forgetting all about the coercion, forgetting all about Scientology, forgetting all about um the feeling that, especially with Jane Doe 3, when she repeatedly kept saying, I wanted better for him, I loved him.
Yep,
Under the teachings of Scientology, it was my job to get him to Scientology to talk to them about this because it was wrong.
that's right.
And yet I was working on saving him. I was working on him being better. Like, I cared about him. She gave them a plausible reason why she was still there, and they took it and threw it out the window.
Exactly.
Like they didn't even hear it. And I
That's
remember
right.
that testimony going, I don't know if I could be that generous to somebody like that, but I understand where she's coming from. She talked about him bringing her into Scientology, and that she really believed it. She thought it was something good. She studied more than he did for years.
I'll tell you, it's almost more powerful than Scientology's influence in this case, this business of this implicit bias that people are bringing into the case. Because something you just said is so spot on with this, which is, it's as though the jury didn't even hear her. They
Yes,
didn't.
they
That's what
didn't.
bias does to you. That's what I'm trying to get across, is like, this stuff is powerful.
Mm-hmm.
And you nailed it.
Yeah.
That's exactly the problem, is it's like they don't even hear
Mm-hmm.
the facts that are being presented to them, because they think they already know. And
Exactly, because they were trying so hard not to be biased. Because here's the thing, we watched Philip Cohen bring up he complained that Scientology was mentioned 700 times, and I can guarantee you that he was had 500 of those mentions himself.
exactly.
Okay? Because he did it very craftily. He wanted to prove there was a bias. So what he did was create one. He
Mm,
created the fear of a bias in that jury. He created the opposite bias. Cool. I have no legal background. I'm just a layperson. I just love the law. I said, but I need to be out here screaming about this, but there's nobody I can talk to. I'm watching him actually create jury bias. I
sure.
A reverse jury bias. when he picked on all the different words, okay? When he said that you're going to go against Danny just because he's a Scientologist, and he said it over and over and over again. Now, anytime one of the witnesses had anything to do, say that Scientology was a reason for anything, total, like, don't hear it, disregard it, gone. Because if I pay attention to that, I'm being biased to Danny, and I can't be biased to Danny. If I can't listen to them, I'll be biased to Danny. It was like, what are they gonna do? What are they
Yeah,
gonna
no,
do?
it's a good point. You're making a very good point.
Yeah. As much as we made fun of Cohen, and I loved when the judge called him out repeatedly because he
Mhm.
needed to be, but I'd have to say, well done. I always said that during the whole trial. He's definitely doing 150% for Masterson, and he did a damn good job of creating the reverse bias there and creating it that you can't go this far. You can't stop over this. Don't you dare think about that. Don't you dare cross that line. Don't you do this. Don't you do that. He did a damn good job of that.
Yeah, I
Um,
have to agree with that. He
yes.
definitely earned his money.
Unfortunately, and he's going to be on the team for the trial. Now the trial is set for April, I believe.
I think they said March 26th.
Oh, March 26th. Okay, right. That's quick.
Yeah,
And yeah,
yeah.
and
Well, they've had all this time to prep. I mean, obviously they'll have time to prep a new case, and it sounds like the prosecution is taking into account, almost everything we're talking about in one fashion or another. And I think we're going to see a much, much, much more complete case being made than what we saw before. I will be critical of the prosecution. I'm being told that they're a bunch of good guys and they know what they're doing and they're professionals and they don't lose cases. But I did not see that reflected in what I observed of this case. I just didn't. And I'm very frustrated, of course, about the
yes.
Scientology aspect of it, that the judge
Mhm.
kept no, 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 and kept admonishing the jury. We talk about creating some bias. The judge herself was doing that too.
Yes, she was.
Constant admonitions to the jury.
Mhm.
It's not Scientology. It's just their state of mind. It's not Scientology. No, it is Scientology.
That was the
Should
state
be
of
on
mind.
trial too.
Scientology was the state
Now,
of mind.
yeah.
And I'm hoping there'll be a little more leeway, or at least a go around for the prosecution on that. What I did admire about the prosecution is they had some foresight. I do think they were also rather clever. And
Mm,
I'll lay it out to you this way:
yeah.
36 witnesses, and they didn't only presented 16, leaving them a brand new case to present if there was a mistrial. First of all, she kept saying, I need a condensed case. We're going to do this on my time schedule. End of story. You're not getting more time. So they picked what they could to present the case for us, but they still have the 3 witnesses. They still have witness number 4. It was allowed in this trial. They're not going to be able to keep it out of the next one. Yeah.
I would disagree with you a little bit on that, in that I think that it was not the prosecution's choice to cut down their
Oh,
jury
no, but
so
yeah,
much
because of
as
the time, right?
well,
Yeah.
exactly. And that time, let me point out something here. I believe that the judge was driving that. The judge Almeida was like,
Mhm.
hey, taka taka, let's go now. We're going to get this thing wrapped up by Thanksgiving. And she ran the whole thing, bop, 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 right? And I thought she ran it too hard. It was like,
Mhm.
could you let them make their case? And that's, I think, her effort to make this a speedy trial actually hampered the
Mhm.
prosecution's ability to make a complete case. That's my take. Again, I'm not an
Yeah,
expert,
no,
but
no, I can
you
see
know,
that. I could see that. I could also see that her pushing, always letting Cohen's grandstanding every time they came back into the courtroom about whatever he saw outside of it, trying to get a mistrial like the whole time. Her trying to prevent the mistrial actually tied the hands of the prosecution a lot, I believe.
yeah,
By letting Cohen do a little bit more because he's the squeaky wheel, he's claiming, mistrial this and throw out this, and you're being biased this, and he's actually setting the tone for everything, and the prosecution's hands are being tied on the pushback,
yeah,
because of the speed, like you said, and because she's trying, to run it that there's not going to be a mistrial, nobody's going to cross over any lines, so
right.
it's almost as if, because the prosecution was following the rules that were set forth by the judge, that they got penalized, while the squeaky wheel
Exactly.
over there that had to get smacked back all the time by the judge was getting all the attention and the jury's ear. Okay,
right.
like I think you make a good point though about the time that she did direct that. So I was kind of happy that she used the fact that the prosecution would have a stronger, better case at the retrial, and there should be a retrial. She mentioned it, she said it, she laid it out to Cohen. No, you're wrong. There absolutely will be a brand new trial. That tells me she's aware of the fact that she may have affected the trial with the timing and
I
with the
think so too.
limitations,
I
and
think
I'm
so too.
hoping there'll be a little more leniency on what they're able to present,
Yeah.
because I think just reading some of the things she said, when she took the time to tell Cohen that his argument was emotional and he didn't bother to bring any legal precedent forward, that took her only moments to go find. That was a solid point. Like, this ain't going to happen again, dude. Bring your legal game, because this stuff is not happening in trial number two. If he's paying attention, he should read the undercurrent there.
Yeah,
Like,
exactly.
I'm going to be looking for legal precedent here. You're not emotionally going to gang up on that jury again.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm
I hope
hoping
that
so.
I hope so too. I really do. It's interesting. I had my views on the interview and the outcome and the trial itself. I've been, I've run into other ideas and other opinions about it, and I don't know. I keep coming back to what I come back to, my understanding of how this stuff works and how this process should go. This was not a well put on case for a number of reasons, and there were errors at every level. So, you see, yeah, we have problems with the jury, we have problems with the prosecution, we have problems with the judge, and of course the defense attorney I've all kinds of problems with, but I can't fault him for doing his job. I can certainly agree with the judge that if his job is appealing to emotion, then that we don't want that.
That
So,
we don't want that, because that
yeah,
basically was the filing that he started to try to get everything tossed,
right,
was basically all emotional. Like she said, like, you're appealing to the emotions of the court, and I need legal precedent. And I found it in 5 minutes, what you're talking about, but you didn't bring it, so I don't
right.
have to consider it. You know, basically,
Yeah,
which I was like, yo, judge, like, way to tell him that it ain't gonna work for round two. But when you think about it, first of all, the hearing from Tuesday, like, do you have anything about I mean, I'm talking about things that she said and stuff like that. I mean, did it change any way you thought about after the mistrial happened? I know we were all greatly disappointed, and we knew there was going to be another trial, she said right away, but then the motion to dismiss came forward. And how did that make you feel first? I mean, you guys were mentioned in a motion to dismiss. Like, way to get famous there, Chris.
yeah, I know, right. I it was funny. There was contention about releasing that interview, and a lot of thinking about it. It wasn't something we did lightly. Um, the opportunity presented itself, and it was too good to pass up. There was no way I was not going to do that
Mhm,
interview. In terms of releasing it, I was trying to solve problems that were not directly connected with the case. In other words,
mhm,
I didn't think that interview was going to hold a whole lot of sway with the court or the prosecution, right? Why would it? It's an interview with a juror who
mhm.
happened after the fact of the trial. The trial was over. The
Right,
juror is no longer a juror. I mean, he's just Joe Citizen now.
right. And there
And
was no gag order. There was no reason he
there was,
couldn't
we
speak.
checked. That's right. There
Mhm,
was no, as long as he wasn't getting paid for it, and we definitely did not pay him. Um, as long as he didn't get paid for it, then he could say whatever he wanted to, and that's why we wanted to interrogate him about it.
mhm,
Um, I released it because all the buzz in the media and on social media was Scientology got to the jury. It's all about Scientology. It was all Scientology centric.
mhm,
And of course, I live in that world, so maybe I was in my echo chamber. But I thought, that's all I saw and heard. And
mhm.
knowing, having talked to the man before we did the interview, I knew none of that was true.
Right.
And I didn't want there to continue to be wild ass misspeculation as to what had happened in the trial. I wanted the truth of what happened to get out, so people in general could understand a few things. One, Scientology ain't that big of a deal in a lot of people's minds. Two, the ability of the prosecution to even make a case regarding Scientology was hampered from the beginning by the whole First Amendment mandates and problems with talking about it. And three, regardless of Scientology, they just didn't make a solid case, that the jury could, the jury was like so caught up in their own bullshit that they weren't really paying attention to the case being made to them anyway. So it was kind of both sides of this I was finding fault with. And I wanted people to see that so that they would get how this really works, how the sausage is really made, not how they imagine it happens.
Exactly.
That was my point in doing it. We were pretty sure, I was sure, I told myself at least, that I didn't see how this would affect the outcome of another case. I mean, how would getting the truth of what happened damage things is kind of the logic I was thinking with, right? It was like, because there were people who were like, well, it's reckless and it's bad and it's wrong and it could mess things up. And I'm like, but it's the truth. It's what happened. And people should know what happened. And that was where I was coming at it from, because I'm a firm believer that in the principle that if you don't have the data you need to make logical conclusions, you're going to be almost guaranteed to come up with illogical ones.
Exactly. I'm very impressed that even though you knew that there was all that talk about Scientology out there, it was important for you to get it out there that no, that they didn't interfere. And that speaks to your credibility on what you do on your channel, the views in general, to make sure it's not misinformation.
Right.
That it's like, if we have something to say about what Scientology is doing, there's a reason. Like, it's not just because we're against it as like a cultish type religious organ or the coercion and all of that, but that, fact is fact. And I applaud you for that. And also, I think your interview did good at getting the understanding of where that jury was coming from.
Right.
And I think that that's going to aid in the next trial, because now there's no doubt that the prosecution has seen that interview. I mean, they had to, since it was mentioned in the motion to dismiss. They're going to want to know why. So I'm sure they've seen it. And hopefully some of those points will even in just how they direct themselves to the jury.
Let me say this in regards to the question you asked earlier about the hearing and what did that do for me, or what did that tell me? It told me that what we put out in that interview, the prosecution already knew from their own discussions with the jury right after the case.
Right.
I've been critical of the prosecution, but I don't want to imply or infer that I think that they're a bunch of doter heads, or a bunch of idiots, because they're not. I don't, want to come across like I'm Mr. Know-it-all with this and, oh, Miller doesn't know what he's doing and all that. It's like I might have mouthed off on a few things with that, but it was only out of my frustration at the lack of result, and I think this prosecution team is capable of putting on an incredibly good case. And I really, really hope that this retrial gives them the opportunity to do so, because they nailed it. They knew already what had been going on before we even did the interview. The interview wasn't for them. Well, I should say I wasn't aware of that until after the fact of the interview. So I didn't know what the prosecution knew or didn't know until that hearing and some other things came up. So it wasn't an effort to try to help the prosecution team find out what they did wrong, but it was more for the public than it was for that purpose.
I think it was important for them to hear. And I was very pleased to see, like you, in the hearing, what questions Mueller was asking of the jury. You could tell right away where he was going and how he was approaching what was discounted and what wasn't, and what points could be made. Like it's like they were really thinking about it ahead of time, and that made me encouraged that they were going to move forward. Absolutely, the prosecution is going to come with their end game, and there's going to be a retrial. End of story. It was still, even though it was presumed it would be based on what the judge had said, that we're going to do it quick, we will put it on the calendar. The prosecution has to agree that they're going to come forward, and then the defense actually threw the monkey wrench in there with I knew he was going to, because how many calls for mistrial did he actually throw up during the
Oh God,
trial?
or at
There
least
was
9.
no way
Please.
he was not going to do a motion to
Of
dismiss
course.
before the
No,
hearing. There was
of
no
course
way.
he was.
Yeah,
Of
yeah.
course he was. I was, of course, a little surprised
To
that
be
he used
mentioned, I'm sure. You didn't know you
yeah,
were going to be the motion to dismiss. Like,
that was absolutely not on our radar, and I'm
yeah.
a little pissed, to be honest, that it was used for that purpose when that clearly was not what we were trying to do.
Mhm.
That pissed me off. That was
Yeah.
a fuck you from Masterson to us.
Mhm.
And I didn't appreciate that.
Exactly.
Guy, he needs to be in jail. That's my
Yeah.
bottom line attitude on all of this.
Mhm.
And I do want to make that clear. Using our work to try to defend himself and keep himself out of jail is
Mhm.
despicable,
It
right?
is. It makes you wonder why he doesn't want anybody talking about that individual. If his life is so good right now, some of the ones that are in support, they don't even say it didn't happen. They say, why bring it up now? He's like got a life, he's moved
That's
forward.
right.
And I'm like, you're not even denying that it happened. You're
Exactly.
not even going there and saying that it didn't happen. You're saying,
Exactly.
why bother me now about it? It's been so long. Like, that's your argument?
That's right.
That's not justice. That you are so do you realize what you're saying to a victim when you do that?
Worse, because they blatantly basically got away with that in the courtroom too. They never even had to say he didn't do it.
No, yes.
I mean, the defense had such an easy time of this. Again, Cohen was working. It wasn't that it was just, some smooth ride. I mean, as
Mhm.
you pointed out, he was manipulating, he was poking holes, he was doing all this stuff. He was doing his job. It's frustrating to see how
Yeah.
easy it was made.
Especially when I want to ask you about one statement that I may not have heard correctly, and I hope you'll correct me because it's really bothered me. I think it was the closing statement or one of the statements to the jury that Philip Cohen had made. And it kind of, I don't remember the exact words, but because of the way it jolted me, I can only talk about how it felt. So the words that I heard were, if Danny Masterson believes there was consent, there was consent. They were in a relationship, something of that nature. Like if Danny Masterson believes there was consent, he's not guilty. It
Yes,
basically is what he said.
that's it
Okay.
was part of the statute, if I remember right.
Okay. And I'm like, what?
Yeah.
So what? Like,
Yeah, there's a thing about, forcible compulsion, that kind of thing. I wish I understood this better myself. I do not understand how it's possible that there's a legal principle that if somebody is sleeping and you have sex with them, that's not forcible rape. I don't understand how that's possible. The Cohen was making that point. He was saying that,
he was saying,
and I
okay.
don't know that was true or not, but he definitely said that.
And I know that the jury heard it based on
Yeah,
what they're saying, because here there is, and I do believe the judge actually repeatedly said that the definition of rape is penetration without consent, period. Like, and these women all three, all four stories, because I'll bring the other witness in too. She's not one of the claimants, but she's a witness, told the same exact story. They said no. They fought back. They said they didn't want it even after it started.
that's
They
right.
said no. And the judge is clearly telling the jury that even if that happens in the middle of the act, that's penetration without consent. Cohen was trying to make some small point about offenses, and she just went right out there with it. Like, no, this is the legal definition of it. She tried to clarify it for the jury, but all they hear is
I know.
not guilty if he thinks there was consent. So in other words, if you're in his bed, anything goes. Okay. So
Yeah,
like
exactly.
regardless of how you got there, half of them were dragged there or possibly inebriated there against their will to begin with, coerced, however the words you want to use. It's not,
That's right.
uh
I
I
really hope that they get that all clear. That was the point where I really thought Almeida shined as a judge when she was
mhm.
taking Cohen to task. it was for a reason, and she really did a good job of reining him in a few times on some of his more nonsensical stuff. I think also that chart, I didn't see it, we didn't actually see this, but it was described that there was some chart he showed in closing about levels of guilt or
The levels of guilt,
you know,
not
and
that's what how
you know,
frustrating is that? It's not that Danny's not guilty, it's the level of guilt you need to apply to
yeah,
what Danny
it's
did.
like, dude, you know,
And yet the jury still said, "Nope, the women, we can't believe them."
that's
Even
right.
though their own defense is saying it's all a matter of degrees of the guilt. Like, not that the guilt isn't there, but just the levels of degree that he had. And that was going along with that thing. If Danny believes there was consent, then he can't be guilty. Like, it was going
Right.
along with that
And that
whole
was just
premise.
ridiculous. It was
Yeah.
ridiculous, but it was seed planting. You're absolutely right. It was definitely seed planting in the jury's mind, and those seeds grew. You know, they got something for that, and
It's
that's feeding that bias that I was talking about before. You
mhm.
know, that we talked about. It's just this
I
you know, I wish there was some way, and maybe there'll pay more attention to this in the jury selection in the next trial of filtering out for that kind of bias. You know, it's
mhm.
like they were all crazy. You know, there was that question about Scientology, and we got to make sure we don't get anybody who's biased about Scientology, and they were all freaking out about that. But I think we need to freak out a little bit more about this misogynistic bias. You know?
I do too, because remember, one of the first things the jury asked to see was that chart.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, and that wasn't even evidence.
That's right.
Okay, jury, you have to be reminded that anything that comes out of his mouth is not evidence, but yet all you're focusing on is everything Philip Cohen said.
Right.
That is what your interview with the foreman Earl proved to me.
That's right.
Because
Well,
everything coming out of his mouth was more focused on what Cohen presented, not the evidence that was presented, but what Cohen said about it.
exactly. And
Period.
that's our proof that the bias exists because
Right. So I know people are going to come at us saying, "Oh, you've got a lot of nerve calling them biased," but no, I'm actually thought about it. I'm not trying to be slamming on them. I wish it was different. I really do. I hear what you're saying. I see it. I
yeah,
see it. I saw it play out. I saw them paying more attention to what the defense attorney said than the evidence that was presented. And then I heard them actually admit it.
yep,
Like, and say it. That's how they were looking at it. That's what they did. Every time yourself or Tony brought up actual credible evidence, all I kept hearing was, "Well, we didn't really look at it like that. We didn't look at that. We didn't."
exactly.
That's not what mattered, because the defense said, or they did, and they're like, "But then we had this to consider." And I'm like, that's all just the words. Like, that's not what I understand is the process of jury deliberation. It's
Yeah,
supposed to be looking
exactly.
at the evidence.
I
Yeah.
I kind of wish in retrospect, I'm still on the fence about this. I'm really not sure, but I'm wondering, should that opportunity present itself again, whether I might be a little bit more challenging in my interview tactics. Because I went into that premeditatedly thinking, I'm grateful that he's willing to do
Mhm.
this. He's not going to do this with anybody else. At least that's what he told me. And I want to get as much information from him as possible as to what happened. So I don't want to put him on the defensive.
Exactly.
And that was my attitude going into that interview. And I'm thinking right now, I'm just sort of wondering, you know, maybe after getting all that information, I should have confronted him on some of this more directly. But I just didn't see the point because he's not crucial to the process anymore. He
Right.
was a
Yeah.
crucial part of the process.
Mhm.
Now it's over, and nothing he says or does at this point is
Mhm.
going to change anything. And the fact that the defense attorneys got him to sign an affidavit, I don't know if you know this or not, but he signed an affidavit for the defense team in in in
In
um
the motion to
in the
dismiss.
motion, right, to dismiss that he
Oh my
supported
god.
that. And
Oh,
I thought that was pretty disgusting. And
you
I
know,
was like, wow. So
that is
it,
wow.
yeah, it kind of, it's definitely suspicious behavior. Let's put it that way.
Doesn't that show bias, just that right there?
My point. right? My exact point. And it might show even worse. And I'm not going to be Mr.
Just the
Conspiracy
fact that
guy
he
right
thought that
now.
that
But
was acceptable as a jury member
yeah.
to weigh in on one side or the other.
Yeah.
I mean, have your personal opinion, Mr. Juryman. I get it. But to weigh in legally on one side or the other,
Yeah.
that speaks volumes right there. But here was one question that if you ever get the opportunity to talk to him again, I wanted to know is the jury instructions, the judge's jury instructions on what the actual deliberation process was all about. I want to know how they actually interpreted that. I want to know what they heard because what she presented it needed to be done. I don't really see them doing as far
Oh,
as the evidence.
yeah.
She pretty well laid it out, you
Yeah,
know.
I'm not sure how to respond to that one. I know that he certainly claimed that they reviewed and re-reviewed and re-reviewed again. I think he said 3 different times they went through a 40-page binder of requirements and rules that they had to follow. It was 20 pages or 40 pages or something. It was this big chunky
Mm-hmm.
document that they had to do, and the judge both read it to them and then they had to read it themselves. And so I don't know what to say about that in terms of procedure. I mean, the fact that they didn't come up with the outcome we want doesn't necessarily prove anything,
True.
but the bias that they displayed does. And I think
Right.
and the fact about the tricky thing and the crazy thing for me about bias, knowing what I know about it from my psychology side of life, is people aren't aware of their bias. That's the whole problem with bias. Is you don't
Exactly.
know you got it. So it's a little hard to police it, self-police for it, or read some instructions and go, "Oh yeah, I've got all these biases." Like it doesn't really work that way.
Mhm.
So it's a little hard to. That's why you have so many people in a jury, because they're supposed to be policing each other on that kind of thing. And
Right.
unfortunately, that process is only as workable as people know about it and practice it. And it doesn't sound like this jury was able to come to any kind of consensus on pretty much anything,
Yes.
and that really sucked.
Yeah, looking at like how many guilties were going around in regards to all 3 of the charges. It seems like the Jane Doe testimony for number 1, they did not actually go with it all. There was only 2 people that found that credible enough to be guilty.
That's
That
right.
was concerning to me, because she was talking a lot, but it may have been the amount of talking that did her in, on that.
Hard to say. I've heard
Yeah,
different things about it in terms of the quality of the testimony and the corroborating testimony and all that. And I don't have an opinion on it one way or the other because I wasn't
yeah,
there. I was
but
hearing from observers, and I thought, well,
mm,
that's interesting. I mean, again, it kind of pointed to the strength of the case and the strength of the
mhm,
witness prep and stuff like that. And I, that's
yeah,
that's something the prosecution needs to deal with.
yeah, they do.
Yeah,
I have to say, as always, this is always a great discussion with you about this. It's so nice to be able to talk to someone, that has the Scientology behind it and was following it legally, and to find out that, even for myself, reassuring that some of the things I saw, I actually other people have saw too.
I guess I would like to. I guess I would like to leave one last note on this thing in terms of the Scientology thing, because it really hasn't come up much in our discussion.
Hmm.
The Church of Scientology is a destructive cult.
Yes.
It does do illegal things, and it will break the law at a moment's, without a second thought, if it feels that it's necessary to protect itself or protect its principles, right? Like Danny
Hmm.
Masterson. And I have no doubt, and I've said already that, I am positive Scientology had full dossiers put together on every juror, on the
Hmm.
judge, on the prosecution case, looking for personal problems, proclivities, issues, blackmail material, stuff like that. That's what Scientology does. But here's the thing, and here's something to kind of leave you with in terms of an appreciation of this, is they can be subtle.
Hmm.
Just because they can be ham-fisted and stupid and very, very blunt sometimes and overbearing doesn't mean that there's not another part of that operation that you never see or hear much about.
But we did actually see it in the trial. I know 2 instances myself that looked like great intimidation, if not even witness tampering. And that would be the friend's testimony that changed
Yep.
because of one conversation with the private
investigator in the
investigator
hallway. Yep.
for the defense, came up, said something, and all of a sudden he remembered something from not in any of the interviews, not in any of the affidavits, not in any of the conversations over the 10, 15 years that it's been, not even in the phone calls with the Jane Doe that are recorded with him. Okay. Never came up, but because of that one conversation in the hallway, boom, totally different testimony. Just had to disregard all of it now because it's tainted. Like, I could see the jury just going, we can't, this isn't corroboration or anything. Like, they didn't go for the defense or the prosecution on it. It just seemed to be tossed completely out based on that.
Well, I was referring to, I mean, absolutely. And I was referring more to things we don't know about.
But that's subtle. That was subtle right there.
Well, it
That
was
was
subtle.
it
It was
was,
subtle.
it
Uh,
was, they mentioned, oh, where did you take any trips? And then boom, he remembers like that he's been
yeah.
in Florida with her the whole time, which no one could corroborate. No one. Okay,
Yeah.
but of course he was there, but he wasn't there for that one. Okay. And also the intimidation of one of the Jane Does after the testimony, to where when everybody was brought back in or asked to leave because she was having a panic attack, and the Masterson side just stood there and stared at her for an X amount of number of minutes additionally.
Sure.
Notably, that is a subtle intimidation type of tactic,
Yeah.
like, "We're watching you." I don't know. I know it happens a lot, but to me, I was like, I wouldn't wanna be her sitting in that chair having my panic attack, and know that that was going on. Like, that wasn't necessary when it
Well,
was
they
spoke
were
of.
definitely there and forced to support Danny, and that is going to be intimidating, and there's no question about that. And if they could engage in psychological mind fuckery during the
Mhm.
trial, they'll absolutely do it.
Were
Uh,
you fascinated by how many other Scientology lawyers or their associates were there in the seats watching everything going on?
was
Although
was I fascinated by that?
yeah, I mean, is that typical? I think
Oh,
it's
yeah.
typical. Yeah. Like,
Absolutely. Oh, there was absolutely a running record of what was going on, going straight to David Miscavige's ear almost
mhm,
every day. I mean,
mhm.
there's no question he would have been intimately involved in the details of every part of that process.
In my opinion, and this is only my opinion, it's not like they could not foresee that something like this wasn't going to happen. They've known of Masterson all along, and he's had a free pass as an upstart for all of his bad behavior, even when he was younger. Like, as a younger Hollywood influence in his 20s, was at every big parties, all of this stuff going on, kind of against what they do traditionally inside teaching of the Scientology part, but he gets this free pass. How do they not think after the complaints that are coming forward? It's not like they didn't know what was going on
Oh,
because
no, they just
yeah.
thought they had dealt with it years ago.
Mhm.
They they thought they dealt with the women, they paid the women off, they did this, they did that. They thought it was all swept under the rug and everything was going to be fine.
Mhm. How do you think that the civil suit is going to proceed now?
I mean, I think the civil case is probably going to be continued to be put on hold because of the criminal case continuation.
Mhm. Mhm.
I think,
It
but
would make sense. You
yeah, I
would,
mean,
yes.
it would
Yeah.
make sense. But absolutely, Lisa Marie's testimony, both in the criminal case and the civil case, is absolutely vital to get in front of a jury.
Mhm.
It
You
was
know,
it was mind blowing to me that Almeida would not allow her to testify to the
mhm.
facts in that criminal case because that was absolutely relevant information.
It was, except for that she had already decided that the civil case was not going to be part of the trial. Well, she said that for the purpose of keeping the trial brief,
Yeah.
since the issue of time delay has already been addressed, we don't need Lisa Marie. I mean, that's clearly what she said. We don't need to hear it again. I think it would have been good to hear it again because it would have really homed the point in, because I don't hear the jury actually saying anything about the coercion that was going on. Even the fact when they testified that they were still being harassed on a regular basis, I heard
Yeah.
nothing from the foreman in regards to that. Thank you, Chris. Anything else you want to end with before we wrap up?
Yeah, no, I'm all good. I just
Okay.
wanted to say those things, and I just wanted to say that I think I think the point I was trying to make a minute ago, just because we have the apparency that Scientology was not as active in this case as we all maybe thought it should have been or could have been doesn't mean that they were not engaging in hanky-panky nonsense behind the scenes that we still don't know about.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to be clear about that. I released that jury foreman interview to give the state of mind of the jury and where their heads were at. But let's be clear that that doesn't mean Scientology was not back there influencing things covertly. So we have a bunch of facts. We've put them together the best way we know how to figure out what just happened
Mm-hmm.
in that trial. But it's very possible that in the future, more revelations could come forward as to other nonsense Scientology was engaged in behind the scenes here to push or move this jury one way or the other. And I just wanted to throw that out there so we don't have anybody thinking Scientology wasn't really that big of a thing in this case. It's central to the case.
It is.
I believe. I mean, it's not the case, though. And let's be clear, this is a assault.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what they need to be focused on. But the Scientology aspects in and around this thing, I don't know. I can't see how that's not crucial
Well,
to understand.
you can't deny it. They were all Scientologists at the time.
Right.
Scientologists had a lot to do with whether it got reported or whether it didn't. How come it took so long for them to formulate? It has to do with motive also. It has to do, with everything. Actually, the teachings themselves when it comes to the actions of Masterson and the women. Scientology is all over it. There's no denying it. It's unfair of the defense to say you can't judge us for being Scientology when you are Scientology. Okay.
Exactly.
I had a big kick about don't mention Scientology when Scientology is the one that entered the Book of Ethics. Okay. The defense did that themselves, the previous lawyers. Okay. Who brought that in? The defense. And then spent the rest of a nice long trial complaining that it's in there. Thank you, Chris. As always, totally enjoyable conversation. I look forward to more because we're going to be talking about Scientology some more, you and me.
You bet.
There's plenty to talk about. You have a wonderful day. I thank you again so much for this. Everybody going to check out his channel. I'll have everything linked below in
Awesome.
regards
Thanks,
to.
Todd.
Thanks. You have a good day.
Bye-bye.